Peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our channel. Welcome back. And today's topic in our health and wellness series is about natural time and natural calendars. So we're going to be talking about the importance of time. How do you measure time? Is time something that you measure linearly, or is it something cyclical? And we're going to talk about natural calendars. And our ancestors, the ancient ones, had calendar systems that were based on natural phenomenon and cosmic events. And so we're going to be talking to our beloved brother today, Mikuak Rai, who's going to take us deeper into the subject of natural time and calendars. So welcome.
Thank
Peace
you.
and blessings.
Peace and blessings to you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I have a deep interest in the subject of calendars. I think it's something I've had the privilege of studying for almost 20 years in terms of some of the timing systems that have been reintroduced, we'll say, to us in the contemporary sense. And so for me, it deeply relates to the idea that time is art. Time is not just money, but time is art. And so a lot of my own personal interest centers around creative pursuits, be it music or media production or supporting other people in that space. But it's because, there's a difference when we live according to a timing that actually supports or encourages creativity, then these things begin to emerge more in our lives. And as I've been studying this for quite a few years, it has absolutely supported that access to those parts of myself. So a little bit about myself, that's a little bit.
Well, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And can you tell us what exactly is natural time? What is meant by the phrase natural time?
So natural time is a terminology that indicates natural cycles or timing kept by traditions, peoples of the world who have tracked and monitored different natural cycles or phenomena, as you said. So such as we find with the solar or with the equinoxes as well as the solstices. That is one example of natural timing. Another example could be considered the lunar cycle itself and the effect that that has on the human body. And other natural cycles would be even that which the Dogon are attributed to marking or having received knowledge of, which are the cycles of Sirius A and Sirius B, which are also having an impact on our experience here on planet Earth. So when we look at natural time, it's a combination of our galactic, our solar, and our lunar calendars or timings, observations, and how they work in harmony or in sync with each other. And then we have a relationship to that as well. So natural time is, as well as the observation of it, it's how we actually navigate according to these creative patterns or cycles.
Oh, that's awesome. So can you tell us about the calendar system?
Well, if we're speaking on the calendar system that's predominantly in use, is that the one you're referring to? Or?
Yes, what's the difference between the calendar that the ancestors use versus the Gregorian calendar? And why that's important? Why do people create calendars?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a many-layered question. I think people create calendars for different reasons. I think that there is a way through which our ancestors navigated life that was according to the rhythms of nature. And so by creating calendars that helped make sense of the recurring cycles, such as the lunar cycle again, and how that relates to then the annual solar cycle. Those are two different timings that are observed to then begin to become synchronized, or the observation of them identified. So when you begin to add other cycles into that, you can begin to see how these multiple patterns are working with each other and how they intersect and how they repeat. So a calendar system originally, in many cases, was to be able to navigate according to your place in space and time, as in those cycles. Another use of the calendar is to exact control over people, in the sense that the Gregorian calendar itself, that's the dominant calendar in use today, for over 400 and almost 440 years, almost in that range, is one that was such calendar. So that was created. It was an adaptation of the Julian calendar that preceded that. The Julian calendar itself was from the Roman era, hence the Julian calendar.
After Julius Caesar. Okay.
Yeah, named after Julius Caesar, and was used essentially to create a system to collect land tax or tax to the rulers. So the calendar itself was essentially devised as a way to collect debt. So even the word calends, from which the word calendar comes, the Latin word calens, means to account for. So in this case, the idea was they were accounting for the duties required to pay to the empire of the day. So it became a way to collect taxes. And so the adaptation into the Gregorian calendar came at a time when no longer was it the Roman Empire, but it was now the Catholic Church, which, bear in mind, comes from the same soil.
Yes, definitely.
They kind of did what do you call it? Like they rebranded themselves around the time of it was like need to have a rebranding. Because also at that time, you can imagine they were looking at how to expand the Roman, i.e. Catholic Empire, into the rest of the world with the ability to control or dominate, which was really the objective. So the Gregorian calendar in the 1500s occurred around the time of the expansion into the new world, so to speak, with the various systems that were being exacted at that time, such as the bondage of people out of Africa and the transport of people for the purpose of labor. All of those instances, you can imagine that they were operated through the calendar system, which became the fundamental basis for business and commerce in the world at that time. It became the standard of the day. So it is referred to even to this day as the global civil standard of civilization. When we look at that, we understand civilization to them was civilizing the savage world in the new world and those inhabitants that were already here, that had been here for millennia. So the Gregorian calendar, again, the purpose being to dominate, was a way to systematize domination and to organize it, essentially. And that's what we still use today as our primary scheduling system. So we're using a code to this day that was rooted in how to control populations.
And it's something that's not based on any cycles in nature.
Nothing to do with nature. It could be argued that the Julian calendar acknowledged, for example, the solstices and the equinoxes. In fact, there is an event which is considered an error in time, and it's an error because it was an adjustment made. So when the Gregorian calendar was instituted, the day before it was instituted was October 4th in that timing. The next day was October 15th. So 10 days were literally pulled out of the account to try to readjust the timing for when natural things like solstice patterns were actually occurring, and that they were occurring according to a certain timing. But in nature, that timing continues to adjust. So a static calendar, if it doesn't necessarily adjust, is a timing that's off. So the Julian calendar had essentially the solstices identified. So December 21st, in other words, was New Year's Eve. According to that count. But when the Gregorian calendar became the standard and the shift was made, that became your January, December 31st, January 1st, to what we now mark as the beginning of this new year, according to the Gregorian calendar. And that's just been the standard now for centuries.
Well, that brings me to my next question, is about the Mayan calendar. Because when I first saw Brother Mikuak speak, it was in reference to the Mayan calendar in the early part of 2011, I think, in 2000. there was a lot of hysteria and a lot of misinformation out there about the Mayan calendar and this being the end of the world and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about the ancient origins of the Mayan calendar?
Yeah. So, and the mention of that brings up a lot.
Okay.
So the Maya are attributed with the calendrical system, and rightly so. I mean, the complexes and temples throughout Mesoamerica, Central America, Maya land are full of different, very sacred markers and information. One such temple site is called the site of Palenque in Chiapas in the highlands in Mexico. And that particular site has a temple called the Temple of Inscriptions. So I want to acknowledge the work of Jose Arguelles and Loydin Arguelles in responding to this question, because a lot of their work and research in the 1980s was responsible for setting the stage for bringing into mass awareness the completion of the Mayan calendar cycle. Now, bear in mind that when we say the Mayan calendar, it's the completion of one particular cycle. The Maya are renowned for actually observing 17 or 19 different calendars working together. So it wasn't just one calendar that ended, but it was a major calendar that did complete, and then it began again. So the hysteria you reference is the fact that there was a lot of exploiting of the idea of demise and doom and gloom, that it's the end of something. It was the end of a cycle. What it was the end of a cycle where we would be unconscious to the effects of calendars on our awareness. Because the Maya were observing, if anything, evolutionary cycles. By their observation of calendar, they were looking actually at qualities and characteristics that became imbued in the being born on a particular date. But they didn't see the being born in a vacuum. The being is born in relationship to the influences of the galaxy, as well as the planets, as well as the natural earth. You know, so there's a lot that goes into what was translated through these observations and these alignments.
That's a really good explanation. Like when people don't understand what astrology is and all about,
That's right, exactly. So they had their own form of galactic astrology, I would call it. And I keep saying galactic because for the reference for their calendar system that makes it distinct is one of the points around which it pivots is the star Sirius, like many traditional cultures. So when we entered this era of sort of colonization, I don't know what else to call it other than colonization the world over for the past 500 years, we entered a period where we were largely made to forget, or the record of the human relationship with nature was kind of wholesale ignored. And in instances where the society or the groups who lived according to those laws were either subjected to become servants or, made to work for this new world, or they were annihilated. Flat out, and I think that people are aware enough now to understand the historical, circumstances that have been met upon many of the world's people, because we're obviously in the information age now. So that's a good thing, because now we can set the record straight about some of these errors that have affected the sort of trajectory and course of humanity. So the traditional wisdom keepers, the ancient ones, those with prophecy, those with an awareness of nature and our relationship to the cosmos, they've all remarked about this time as being that shift. So when Arguelles and Loydin, Jose and Loydin, when they published information and materials during the 1980s and 90s to bring this awareness to people, largely it was helping to explain some of what had been revealed to them specifically regarding these different timing systems. And they got very deep into how the mechanics of it work and how the counts of the Baktun cycles, for example, worked. And so when you looked at the end of the cycle, the end of the calendar, it was really a period of 5,125 years that came to an end.
Yes.
And so that was essentially 1/5 of a larger cycle that they were observing as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, every so often these cycles will complete, but then they begin again. So the hype was a huge distraction from what otherwise, for many, honestly, for many people, and even now you can see and you can relate to the fact that things are shifting. The nature of how they're shifting is sort of up to, it's subject to what we choose, honestly.
Yes.
So that's kind of part of where the idea of natural time also relates to a person's own creative intention. It relates to, okay, if I am living in tune with the fact that I'm a co-creator with this experience called life, and I can actually work with that in a different way, whereas the former program has said, hey, we're subject to something, we're forced to do something. It's again the difference between time is money and time is art. So it's a shift in perspective, that we talk about when we talk about actually activating or beginning to embody the qualities that are present in the observance of the Mayan calendar and the mini calendars, but how they work together.
Okay. Can you share with us why there's a need for a calendar reform?
Well, I think because we're at a time where, as we've seen in the global stage of the past 10 years, even the past 20 and 30 years, even if you go back as far as the late 80s, we can observe really shifts in geopolitical concern, recognition of the human family more and more. So, for example, with the taking down of the Berlin Wall, for example, that happened at a time where people were actively coming together consciously and conscientiously to pray for peace. So there are phenomena that are able to happen if we shift our minds. The challenge with the calendar we've been living under is it's kept us entrained in a program that even if you have aspirations of escaping that, unless you actually literally make a conscious shift and actually do what could even be considered a revolutionary act, albeit peaceful, to change your calendar is a revolutionary act.
Yes, indeed.
Because it's actually asserting that I recognize that this timing system, its origins, its roots, have been in how to dominate and control even me, the individual, my thinking or my free will. So that's the understanding I reached when I became conscious of the impact of the Gregorian calendar, when it was explained very simply that if you look at the calendar as a standard of measure, you are having an uneven measure if you're trying to build your house on a measurement tool that 1 month says 31, the next says 30, 1 month out of the whole 12 is 28, and these erratic timings, it creates a frequency pattern that's not even.
Yes.
It's disharmonic, and it's hard to observe. So for example, if I was to say to somebody, can you tell me what day of the week, say September 13th is going to be? Like there's no way to be able to process and actually identify that because the timing is so erratic.
Yes.
It's a very complex calculation to make, to try to do it instantly. However, timing is one of those things that's measured that's uneven. So the fact that the way we observe time as an uneven measure itself begs for, can we consider a new timing? Is there another way to approach timing and how we account for it? And so there have been instances of the past century and a half where different thinkers and really knowledgeable people considered the impact of calendars, and they said this Gregorian calendar is not beneficial. It's being enforced, but it's not beneficial. It's not beneficial to your average person. It's beneficial to businesses. It's become beneficial because it's the standard, right? But there was a movement in the 1800s called the Positivist movement that attempted to change the calendar and even recommended a 13-month, 28-day calendar at the time. The challenge was it still started on the arbitrary start date of January 1.
Okay.
So that's not going to be helpful necessarily, not to actually put us in sync with nature's cycles. So speed up into the future, you hit the early 90s after the book The Mayan Factor came out, authored by Jose Arguelles, which is an essential read to somebody who's really wanting to know sort of the origin of where the contemporary work in this direction comes from. That's an essential read, and there are others. So that movement, there's another period actually I shouldn't overlook. So in 1920s, the International Chamber of Commerce also began questioning the impact of the Gregorian calendar, this time on business. Here's the Chamber of Commerce saying, there's got to be a better way to calculate time. There's got to be a better way to organize ourselves in this thing called the calendar. So they put out requests for proposals from people. They got like 4,000 submissions. And the end of it all, 2 submissions were finally kind of being determined which would be the winner. And one was to take the annual year and divide it in quarters, 91 days times 4, 364, plus 1 day to round out the solar year. Okay, as that is, and that's a measurement of the solar year. The other one was a 13-month, 28-day proposal, which is more modeling the month system that we're used to. In fact, the word month is an interesting thing. We hear the word month. Where does it come from? It comes from the word moon. Moon.
Oh, okay.
So a 28-day average is the average cycle of the moon. When you calculate the synodic and the sidereal cycles of the moon, it averages to 28 days. So word month is actually a misnomer the way the calendar is situated, because there's only actually 1 month in the Gregorian calendar, and that's February, because it's actually a true month. It's an even measure of 4 times 7.
Right.
So month, again being moon, 28 days, shows that there's actually kind of an interesting indicator there. The need for a reform comes to say, well, why should there not be 13 months times 28 generally, plus 1 that you have celebrate as the end of the cycle and begin again a new cycle the next day?
Yeah.
So that's actually the proposal of the 13 moon 28-day calendar initiative in the referendum that I've been working on, that is extended from the 13 moon calendar change peace movement of the turn of the millennium, which was the work of Jose and Lodin Arguelles, which was again extended from their work in the 80s and the 90s, bringing to more broad awareness the importance of calendars and the, shall we say, the the accurateness of the Mayan calendar in particular. So, and it's also, again, I say it's attributed to the Maya, but for listeners, it's important to understand the Maya received their star knowledge from the Olmec, who came out of Kemet, who came out through obviously millennia prior, but the transmigration of knowledge and information of antiquity is not to be left out in the conversation, because that's what roots it actually to origin and to source.
Yes.
And then we're also talking about cultures of Africa, of the antiquities of Dogon and others, ancient Kemetic culture, who had the relationship with the star Sirius.
Yes.
And that's translated over the passing of this information here into the so-called New World, where we're at now, and we're here now becoming conscious of what's been operating under the whole time, essentially. But we've been taken off track, obviously, by the Gregorian calendar in a major way. So the idea of the calendar change is not to be romanticized, because it's an enormous work, meaning all our systems currently are operating on the Gregorian calendar.
Yes.
When I say our systems, I'm saying global society.
The modern world,
like,
yes.
we're all here, we're living in Babylon, some would call it, and I think that's accurate.
Yes.
We're living in Babylon, and the fact of the matter is, to transition from Babylon, it's a transition. I mean that word intentionally. You have to transition, because the fact to think that we're just going to stop and suddenly that's the way it works, it doesn't work that way. What we have to transition through is people's consciousness shifting.
Yes.
So not just conscious people who do research, but I'm talking about the people who are ignorant, those who are actually the influencers among the ignorant, and those who have the positions in society and industry and more, that have to also, in order for this shift to change, either they completely have to phase out, which is inevitable anyway. I mean, if you wait long enough, it will phase out. Or they have to begin to be willing to change and come together in conversation and intelligent dialogue with people of the world to actually host the conversations about why a calendar change is beneficial. assuming that there's a critical mass of people that want to do something beneficial for the humanity at large, as it is. If you change the calendar, it sweeps every nation practically into it. You know, there are some nations, to be clear though, that aren't as impacted by the Western calendar, the Gregorian calendar, as people in the West are.
Oh, really?
So there are traditional cultures from India, from throughout the Philippines and in Asia, you know, throughout the world, that have their own calendar systems that work.
And they still follow
They
them.
foster harmony. Like in Bali, there's this particular system, and it fosters harmony. It's a system that works for them to keep them in sync and in rhythm and in tune with nature. So the objective of a calendar truly should and could be to tune you into your purpose. That's the real function of a calendar. Timing is everything. And if we understand ourselves as the time beings, you know, somebody says, oh, the time being, oh, well, you are the time being. So what will you create? That's really the invitation. Because up to now, we've been, again, subjected to a calendar that tells us what to do, when to do it. These are your rites and your rituals. This is where you celebrate your holidays. These are your federal holidays. All that stuff is it's a challenge, because it literally is not. It goes against your actual inherent nature. We've accepted the program. We do accept it because we're able to mete out a certain quality of life. But is it a high quality of life? That's the difference. Stress and duress, it goes hand in hand with the Gregorian calendar.
Yes.
So the erratic timing is an expression of this erratic calendar. So, you know, when we initiated this calendar referendum, it was with the question, what is the impact of the Gregorian calendar on our mental health, writ large as a society?
Okay, well, that would be a great topic for another.
I think so. But that's
Part
sort of
two.
the
That'd be a great
basis
one.
for where we're even taking this information. So if people want to check out more about the campaign, they can go to 13months28days.info. If it is more about the interesting shift that's also happened in this work for me is because the Mayan calendar phenomena came and still exists. It's concurrent. However, the intention of changing the calendar was not yet realized. So that's why I felt it necessary, along with other people who appreciate the importance of this, even as enormous as the work may seem. They appreciate the fact we need to keep this conversation growing and involving more people, which is why it's an honor that you had me here today. The listeners out here and social media will hopefully hear something that piques their interest.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it requires people's awareness and participation. And we're working to also create tools that people can actually utilize on their devices that will help them put a stencil, essentially, of the 13-month calendar over their Gregorian calendar. Because like I said, we're transitioning. It's not a thing where we're saying you suddenly stop using the Gregorian calendar. That's not practical. You know, all the systems, banking, school, everything, even the computation systems are according to that particular frequency. So to transition to a new frequency will take a period of transition. And so we're really wanting to come to the world stage in a big way by this 2020, because it really is it's a phenomenal focus point for this work. In the numbers, I'll just give you an example. This calendar is a 1328 frequency, right? 13 months, 28 days, okay, plus one. The tomb, in particular, I spoke of Palenque. The tomb that was the tomb of the chief Mayan time scientist, we'll call him Pakal Votan, who lived for 80 years in that area. He received his rulership from the matrilineage of his grandmother and his mother. Okay. This is written in stone in there in Palenque is how this happened. And he lived from 603 to 683. His tomb complex, which was created, took years to create, and it was dedicated, like people dedicate and cut a ribbon in a new building here, right? This is a long tradition of people doing this. So they dedicated his tomb in the year 692. If you look at the numeral factor or difference between 692 and 2020, it's 1328.
Oh, okay.
So there's an interesting inference there. It's inferring the idea that the meaning of numbers is present with the work we're doing now, consciously now. So it's like, again, a thread of calendar information that's been passed on, that has been in some ways grasped at different times in recent history, in the past century and a half, has become more refined since the 80s and since the work of Arguelles and Lloydine Arguelles, or Lloydine Burris, I'll say, which is her maiden name. But it brings us right up to now. So there's a lot of information there, but I think the main factor is just to ask people to ask themselves, what is my relationship with time? Is time something that we have all these interesting metaphors on killing time, or just killing time, or,
you run out of time.
Running out of time. There's always this negative spin, usually. So the suggestion is how to actually shift it to recognize that time is your most valuable asset. It's your creative interface with life, essentially. So qualitatively, if there were a timing system that would foster harmony of the mind and the body system, because again, that 28 is our biological rhythm in nature, particularly for our women, our mothers and sisters. That's the thing. You all are the standard bearer of time already. So mind you, this whole, debacle started when we shifted away from that inherent timing system to begin with. And that was again for want of power and control, and probably out of some emotional reacting to fear and abandonment, or all types of stuff is behind that, but where we find ourselves now some thousands of years later, subject to sort of this, from the Gregorian Roman era to now, it's like, or the Grecian era, any of those periods, has led us to now. And, we have now, I think, in our human evolution, we have an ability to push the pause button and say, you know what, we don't have to choose this necessarily, now that we're aware of it.
Right.
It's due to our unawareness and ignorance to what has been happening all this time that we have gone along with the program. But I think by making it conscious in people that they can actually begin to consider and vote in, perhaps make a referendum, a public decision to say, you know what, the old system is first of all, it's destabilized our environment.
Yes.
Like extractive industries thrive because of this Gregorian calendar timing system. It is what they operate on. I'm not saying that you couldn't have industries that could thrive on a 1328. Of course you could, which is exactly why the International Chamber of Commerce tried to do that back in the 1930s. They were stopped because the Catholic Church said, no, you won't. I would also say, in a contemporary lens, the Catholic Church is undergoing so much scrutiny right now. They're showing themselves to be inadequate and completely fallible.
Okay.
If you pay attention to what's happening in the media around all the abuses of children and all these other behaviors, their calendars partly, there's no excuse for those behaviors, but the fact is the calendar allows that stuff to just continue to go on until people say, hey, hold up. This is how y'all been leading this whole thing, like all this time? And how many people have been murdered? How many people have been abused? How many people have been completely disillusioned?
Yes.
By that charade. So time's up for that.
Yeah.
Time's up for all these other things too. Time's up for real.
Okay.
And that's sort of where we find ourselves at this choice point. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're focused on.
Well, thank you. And can you share with the listening audience how they can contact you if they have further questions?
Sure. I can be reached at I'll give you my direct address, but I guess I should look at the camera.
The camera.
I can be reached at by email at mikuak at 13months28days.info. Again, that's mikuak at 13months28days.info. And also the website is 13months28days.info.
Okay.
Online on
All right.
all your devices.
All right. Well, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe below.